Okay, I thought I'd start 2024 with a really positive sunrise with or without the peace symbol. I'm breaking it down into steps that are way easier to follow than you might imagine so that you can have a go too and amaze yourself. Okay, so as explained in the intro, I'm going to break this down into steps so that you learn not only the painting techniques, but also about the tools in the app I'm using, PROCREATE. But that isn't to say that you couldn't use a different app on a different tablet and still follow along. But in terms of this app, PROCREATE, I'm using their default A4 canvas, which is 297 by 210 millimeters at 300 dpi. And another of their default color profiles is the sRGB, and it's the code that ends in 2.1 on the list, so that you know that the colours I'm using will match the ones that you do too. Having said that, please be aware that my camera might oversaturate colours at times, so there might just be a slight discrepancy between what you see on this video and what you see on your screen. In terms of the brushes, I'm going to be using, within airbrushing, the soft brush, possibly also the medium brush, but I'm going to keep this very simple. So maybe in addition to that, I'm just going to go to the organic and use a version of the rainforest brush. And also within elements, I might use the clouds brush as well. In terms of the colors, I've already pre-selected a color palette. Each of these colors, if you go to the value section here, has what we call a hexadecimal code. And each of these codes is down in the video description. So all you need to do is type them one at a time into here or copy and paste. Press enter, and then the color will appear up here in a little circle, and then you can tap it yourself into the color palette. Or next to the codes that are down in the description is a link that takes you to my Patreon page, and you can download the color file for free to save you some time. And Patreon is also the place where you can gain access to exclusive content, extended versions of these tutorials, and obviously support this channel. I'd like to say a massive thank you to those people who have supported the channel either in the past or who are currently doing so. It makes a massive difference to my ability to keep moving forward with this channel, so thank you so much. And with all of that said and done, let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rotate the canvas so it becomes portrait. I'm going to go to the first colour of the colour palette, this nice blue colour, and I'm just going to drag to flood fill the whole canvas. I'm going to go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 2, still with a soft brush with an airbrushing, but I'm going to use the second colour on the colour palette. I'm going to put the brush size up to 50%, so pretty big, and 100% opacity, and just straight through the centre of the canvas, do a band of that colour. And I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we're going to slide that across to about the 70%. Going to go to my layers, just keep them separate initially, we can always merge them together later. Create a new layer, layer 3, go to our colours, the third colour, still with the soft brush with an airbrushing, but turn the brush down from 50 to 15%, 100% opacity, and again about the centre, a band of this, adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur that in to this time about the 60%. And again, just keep them on separate layers initially. Create a new layer, layer 4, go back to our colours, and we're going to use this much more warm yellow colour. If you see on the disc there, you can see it's very much in the yellow compared to the orange and obviously the greyed out pinks and more the blue. So we're back in the fourth colour on the top row, and we'll just decrease it from 15 to 10%, 100% opacity, and again just in that centre area, a band of this. Hold it if you want to keep it as a straight line, it snaps, and then we can go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur that in a little less this time, so maybe about 40%, and then we've got a really nice gradient of colours. I'll go to my layers and create a new layer, but this time I'm going to put it underneath layer 4, and I'm going to go back to my colours. I'm going to use the first colour on the bottom row. This time I'm going to change to the medium brush with an airbrushing. I'm going to use it at around 10% size, 100% opacity, and then just at this centre point I'm going to create a line that perhaps just has a series of bumps and irregularities like this, and then I'm going to bring it down, and you can see it already has a kind of built-in gradient at the top where it fades underneath layer 4. Having said that, I think on layer 5, I'm going to go to the transform and perhaps just move it down a hint more. Deselect. I'm also going to go to the eraser, set the eraser to the soft brush with an airbrushing. I'm going to put it down really quite small, 2% and about 20% strength, opacity. And then just along here, I'm just going to do some bands just to soften that top edge in even more, just so it really blends in quite nicely, but in a slightly more textured way, like that. And then I'm going to go to layer 5 and I'm going to tap on it and put on the alpha lock, which means that anything I add in a different color now is going to stop at the edge of the information that we have on layer 5, which is perfect for what I'm going to do next. So we are going to go back to the soft brush, so the second color on the bottom row. Then I'm going to put a really nice big brush size, 50%, 100% opacity, and just in this bottom section, do a band of that. Still got some of the pink at the top, we're going to preserve. Then we're going to go to the third color and reduce it down to maybe about 30% size, 100% opacity. Again, just in this bottom area, do a band of that. Then I can go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur that in to probably about the 40%. Looks nice. And you can see now we've got a nice gradient just in this bottom section too. Now we can go to some of these layers and we could start thinking about merging them. We're not going to add anything behind these as such, so we can go to all of those layers and just merge them together with a pinch. And now all of that information is on one layer. And that is just really useful in just simplifying the process and just reducing the number of layers so it doesn't take as much memory up of the iPad as it works. Depending on the iPad size, there might be a limit in the number of layers that you're allowed to have open at one time within this app anyway. So this is a good way of just making sure that we don't exceed that. So now we've got one layer again, we need to create a new layer on top, layer 2. On this layer, I'm going to go to the Element Clouds brush. I'm going to go to the 5th color on the top row. I'm going to put the brush size maybe about 25% initially and about 20% opacity. And we'll just zoom in, we're just doing this top section and we're just going to start bringing in across here, and it's going to be really subtle initially and that's absolutely fine. We're just tapping in some texture there at the top. You're going to start noticing some of the pink coming through just a little bit. Then perhaps we'll reduce it down to 15% and up on the opacity to about 40. Then we can just start bringing in some more distinct points of texture in there as well. Zoom back out just to help us understand what we're adding. Then we can reduce it down 10%, add some more in here as well. Have it slightly fragmented perhaps. Perhaps I'll just create a nice big kind of larger clump of cloud in the center area. Could be quite nice. Sort of soften it in around the edge, but then have some areas where it's really quite dense. So anywhere you kind of go over and press over is going to be a thicker clump of cloud. That can be quite nice in some areas. And back up again, 20%, just on the outer edges here. Soften that in. And I'm probably going to go to that layer and put on by putting on the alpha lock. That means we can change color to the 6th color. Perhaps turn the opacity down to 20% and the size to 15. And then we're going to add a sun in this area. So maybe just the bottom edge of those clouds is just going to pick up some more of the light. It's going to reflect it back. We could just bring some of that in a little bit. Maybe we could even turn it down 5%. Just be a little bit more exacting, a bit more controlled where we put some of these highlights. Just kind of focusing the attention a little bit on the bottom edge of some of those clouds. Add a bit more to this one because it's more substantial, so therefore you're going to see the light reflected back of it a little bit more. I'm then going to go and create a new layer, and I'm going to go to the organic rainforest brush. I'm going to go back to the 5th color again. I'm going to have the brush size maybe at 5% and about 30% opacity. And again, we could just add some more texture in here as well, just for some smaller pieces, maybe even turn it down 3%. And we're just going to get some smaller little collections of cloud there in the mix too. I don't want to do too many of those, but just a few. But with that layer, I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and we're just going to blur that in slightly to about the 7%. Looks good. Just softens it in a little bit more. So we're going to go to our layers and create a new layer, layer 4. We'll go back to the organic rainforest brush, but this time I have reset it. So it's more clumped together as individual particles of texture. And we're going to go for the 7th color on the top row. Have the brush size at around 2% and about 25% opacity. And then we're still in the top section. So underneath where we have some of this pink texture, and as we come down into the lighter area, we're almost going to be adding more of a dark color into a lighter area. Now I'm going to almost create like a perspective here where it is larger, perhaps at the sides, and then seems to almost follow like a vanishing point where it gets smaller in the center. So just scribble in some textures and then it gets smaller as you get towards that center point. And then it's just some kind of bands and broken dashes and textures that come in here. But you still want to keep some of that broken. Perhaps I'll turn the brush size down even lower, so lower on the 2%. There is some range within that percentage. So we were just using the upper end of 2%, now we're using the lower end. Now I'm just adding some broken dashes and textures, maybe even lower, into the 1%. And then just as we come down here, perhaps those little dashes and bands kind of coalesce, collect together in more streaks that run across, more substantially across the whole of the sky area. And also becomes a little bit of a repeat of the band that we've got going across there. So 1% back up to the, just into the 2%. Get some slightly bigger forms as we come off to the edge here. Not to say we don't have 1 or 2 here as we come a little bit higher up. A bit more collecting over here again. Maybe down even further to the 1%. And we can really get in there and just create some separation. Smaller points of texture, perhaps. I'm going to slightly soften that, so I'm going to go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur it in just a little bit, maybe to the 3%. Then I'm going to go to that layer, tap on it, and put on the alpha lock. Change brush, so I'm going to go for the airbrushing soft brush. And I'm also going to change color, so I'm going to go for the 8th color, which is the last color on the top row. Put the brush size to a nice controllable size at 3% and about 20% opacity. Strength, and we can just go into that bottom section and just bring in some nice orange colors here, just to vary it up a little bit, just a bit more of a contrast. Not too much though, just a bit. Probably a bit more at the edges is probably going to serve as well. Maybe we can go back to the 7th color. Yeah, maybe just remove it slightly from the middle. Maybe it's better if it's just on the peripheral, on the edges there. So we're going to add a strong sun element that will kind of fuse all of that together really nicely, but we're going to move down into the cloud section first. So we have a combination of clouds. We have clouds kind of above us, and then we have clouds that are more below us. Okay, we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to go back to the rainforest brush. We have reset it, so I'm going to put the spacing up to about 50% again. I'm going to go in with the 7th color on the top row. Lowest part of 3% size, 25% or so opacity. And then just at the very top, I'm going to bring some of that texture in just so it doesn't look too flat. Maybe only to about there, so we can just start to notice it really. Then I'm going to go back to the brush, tap on it again, and maybe reduce the spacing down even more to about 40. Might put the size of the brush up from 3 to 4%. Keep it at the 25% strength opacity. And just do some of this, just a hint of it there. Put it up again, 6%. Maybe have some spacing coming in now. Up again, 10%. I'm going to get some more noticeable kind of distinct shapes, which would be great. Up again, 15, Let's just zoom out. Again, some really distinct shapes in there as we come further and closer to us. And once we got to this point, we can then go to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur. We are going to soften that in just to really create a slight more fuzziness to it, but not too much. So maybe about the 4%. Then we're going to create a new layer, layer 6. I'm going to change the blend mode from normal to add. I'm going to use the elements clouds brush, and we're going to use this really bright orange color, which is 7th color on the bottom row. We're going to put it down to about 3% size, and well, we can start subtle, about 10% opacity, and then always ramp it up a little bit. And we're going to use the textures that it's already given us to kind of build highlights along the top. So we don't need to invent the shapes, we just need to trace around the top edges of them now. Now this is something that can take a little bit of time, but it is worth the time because it creates a really nice texture, a really nice effective kind of natural look of clouds, and the highlights that would bounce off and reflect off the top edges. So look for the top edges of some of these shapes, because obviously we're going to add the sun in here. It's going to reflect this way, and just really pick out that top part of each cloud texture. So you can really go in and around. I mean, you can scribble over it. It's such a low percentage that you really have to mean it. It's not going to accidentally add the texture, add the color at this point. You can have it really collecting as quite an intense color in some places, and then in other areas it just be a little bit more subtle. Perhaps you could even turn it down from 3 to 2%, especially as we get further into the distance there. So look for any of those shapes, add the highlight on the top. As it gets further back, it's going to be less noticeable anyway. It's going to blend with some of the pink up there, and that's a really important part of the effect. There might be some areas where there really isn't any suggestion of texture already and you want to add some, and again, this is the time to really get in there and just kind of add a little bit more. Even just zooming out, you can see some of the effects of that. If you want to really go for it, you could put it up to maybe 20% and really ramp up some of the intensity of this, especially as we go kind of immediately underneath the sun. But I would recommend that you do it at a low percentage and just take your time and kind of enjoy the process a little bit. These kind of shapes, generally, typically, so it's those kind of overlapping shapes. If you keep your gestures in that kind of emotion, then you can't really go too far wrong. And I've got it at a high percentage, maybe somewhere in between the 10 and the 20, so maybe 15 is a good compromise. And we can just work around the clouds. Everything up until this point has been fairly quick and the brushes have done most of the work, but this is the part now, the one part of this tutorial where it's going to be a little bit more labor intensive compared to the rest. And it just means a little bit of fun adding that strong highlight around the top edges of some of these shapes. So settle in, take your time, create a really nice effect for yourself. I think the one thing about cloud textures is that, you know, they can be a little bit time consuming. There's lots of repetitive shapes and texture, but it is an important part. When you find some cloud stamps and brushes that do some of the work for you, but then other times you just have to get in there and you have to do the time building it up yourself. It's not particularly difficult, it is a little bit time consuming, but I enjoy this kind of a texture. Again, you're not really inventing these textures because they're all suggested by the rainforest brush anyway for you. You're just trying to imagine where the light might just pick up on some top edges. Maybe in addition to the top edge, you might just add a couple more in there as well. So again, move to a different section so you can really see that. So we've got maybe down here, the top edge. Let's just trace around it. We could add a couple of extra things in there too. So like this, for example, another edge here, trace around that shape, trace around that one. Perhaps even for the close two sections, you could put it up to the 3 or the 4%, and then it's just going to be a little bit larger, and that could work really nicely too. Maybe even larger. Let's put it up to 6%. There's nothing wrong with it having it really be more noticeable and dramatic in this closer area. Just move across. But then as we get further away, and even in this section, perhaps we need to reduce it down in some places. So 3%, and we've got it at 15%. I'm going to put it back up. I'm going to be a bit bolder, 20%. And obviously this is pressure sensitive, so you press on lightly, you hardly see anything. Press on harder, you get quite a lot. So instead of varying the percentage, you could vary the pressure, the weight of the brush mark instead. So we have the capacity at 20% to be pretty bright. There's no point putting it all the way up there because it's just a little bit too much. And even the light textures then end up a little bit too intense. If you're finding it hard work pressing on all the time, then yeah, you could put it up a little bit higher. So maybe the 40% if you're finding it hard work. And if you're able to do a really light touch, then 40% can work quite nicely for you. So oftentimes the percentages that I will give you, can be changed depending on how you like to work. And for me, this 40% is just about the sweet spot because I'm able to work really lightly and just kind of graze the top edge of some of these surfaces. But if for you, it's happening too quickly and too intensely, then turn that down. I don't really suggest you go any higher than about this 40% though, because it's a bit too easy to go overboard. Again, turn the brush size down 2% as we get further away. I think what I might do at this stage is add the sun glow and then come back to the cloud texture. Then it makes more sense of it and we understand why we're adding it. So I'm going to create a new layer, layer 7, change the blend mode from normal to add again. Going with the soft brush, with an airbrushing, again, stay on this orange, the 7th color on the bottom row, 50% size, 5% opacity, and just in the center here, tap it 3 times, maybe circle it in once, reduce it down to about 20%, tap it 3 or 4 times. Then I'm going to change to this yellow color, put it up to maybe 30%, still the 5% opacity, 2 taps in the center, 15% size, another couple of taps in the center. Then I'm going to change to the white, 5% size, 5% opacity, and just in the center there, I'm just going to add the sun, go over it a few times, and really bring out that bright sun, which really just helps us make sense of everything else. Perhaps with that layer, I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur that in just a bit, to about the 20%. And that's really fused and brought so much of it together. That means we can go back down to layer 6, back in with the elements, clouds brush, and that orange again, 2% size, 40% opacity, and we can really understand why we're adding the highlights now. We have the sun, and it's just going to really inform what we do at this stage a little bit better. So we can see the intensity, and we can see why we're adding the highlights now, and so it makes a bit more sense. And therefore, anything that's immediately in front of, underneath that sun, we know why we're adding a real intense light there, but maybe less, or subtly less, as we get off towards the edges. So we'll zoom in, and I'm pressing more lightly over in this area. It's not to say we don't have the highlights, because it's a very reflective surface, and it's a very bright sun, light source, but we just soften it slightly. Again, just go around the edges of some of these textures. You don't really need to do much invention. Just look, observe, see the shapes that are there, and just trace around some of them. Now I realise that's not always as easy to do. Sometimes it's easy to say, and when you see somebody else do it who's done it a lot, maybe it appears a little bit easier than it does for yourself. But like with anything, it just takes a little bit of time and practice. So don't be disheartened if you're finding it a little bit tough going. Keep practicing, you will get there. So again, we're back to the labour intensive part. Everything else is fairly speedy, fairly easy and quick. This bit is not necessarily that difficult, but it is more time consuming, but you just need to put some of the time in. So I'm going to fast track through this stage of the video so that you can see the next stage that I'm going to add. So I'm just going to focus a little bit more of that intensity in this immediate area underneath, like I say. And it really ramps up, and it's just a beautiful effect. It brings that glow from the sun into this immediate cloud, and I'm really a big fan of that look. One of the huge advantages of working digitally is the blend modes, and it really does help. I'm traditionally trained myself, so I started with acrylic paints on canvas and oils too, and so one of the things that I do wish that was as straightforward and as easy in traditional paint was to, as you know, add this kind of glow, but it's definitely not quite as straightforward as this when you're using traditional materials. But it's one of the beauties and advantages of working digitally. It's just painting light is just really good fun. So again, you can see I've really been focused around this center area quite a lot, tracing around some of these shapes in the middle. So I'm just going to speed through this a little bit, and then you can see what I'm going to add next. So again, I'm just channeling down some of the light in that center area, really making that a priority, letting it kind of fade out as it goes higher up towards that horizon. We really don't need as much, and also perhaps it gets a little bit more stretched out, less bumpy, less noticeable bumps in that texture anyway. What I might do with this texture is go to the adjustments, the perspective blur, put the perspective in the kind of center area here and just slide it across. That way you almost get a sense of movement around the edges, but less so in the center. And I think that works quite nicely. Focuses the eye more into the center area. And perhaps I'll do the same for layer 5. Adjustments, perspective blur, put it similar. And just slide it across a little bit. And just makes these areas slightly less in focus. And just pushes us more into the center area. I'm going to create a new layer, layer 8, but I'm going to put it underneath layer 5. We're going to go in with the organic rainforest brush, and I'm going to tap on that again. I'm going to put the spacing back up to about 50%, and I'm going to go in with the first color that we used, this blue, which is going to appear a little bit lighter. Certainly if you put the pressure up, the opacity up, you can see it. Perhaps we could put the brush size up a little bit more, in fact, maybe the 3%, just 10% opacity. And then, yeah, just so it's not completely lifeless in these shadow areas, we could just add a hint of blue. But I don't want to do too much of that. It's a subtle element, and it's only going to peek through in places here and there. And I also want to soften that in, so adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur that in, maybe to about the 5%. It's just a really subtle detail, but I wanted to add it anyway. Go to our top layer, create a new layer. Now, what I'm going to do at this point, because 2023 was quite a turbulent time in the world, quite a lot of violence, I just want to really start 2024 off with a positive wish for the future. I'm going to add a peace symbol into my sky. Now, it's easy if you go onto Google, just search for peace symbol, and pretty much the first couple of images are really useful. And if you save those as images and then import them, they actually come in without a white background. If they come with a white background, all you need to do is go to the selection, automatic, grab all of the white background, and then go to the layer, tap on it and press clear, and it will get rid of all the white. But like I say, the first couple of images, if you look on Google, will give you an image that has a transparent background, and you can just import it like this. I'm going to put it down, find somewhere where it can sit quite happily. Then I'm going to select a local color by pressing and holding, drag from that color onto the symbol, and that helps it sit in its environment a little bit better. However, I'm also going to go to the adjustments, hue, saturation, and brightness, and just turn the brightness down a percentage, just so it appears slightly more of a silhouette. So 49%, just a hint. I think I might just move it up actually, so the sun is almost in the center there perhaps. Then I'm going to go to the eraser, soft brush, 2% size, 40% opacity, and I think I just want to soften or remove some of this symbol so it looks like it's nestled in the clouds a little bit more. in that location. Maybe the colour of it is slightly off now, but we can adjust that, not a problem. Just nibble away at the edges so it feels like it's sat in the clouds. Maybe you can take away big chunks if you need to. Whatever works. That's kind of more nestled in its environment better. We can also perhaps just put that brush size up to 15% size, down to 10% opacity, and just remove it a little bit in the center where the sun is, just so it looks like the sun is actually bleaching out some of those edges. Maybe reduce it down even more, size 2%, 20% strength, and maybe just around those edges. The sun can really just be having an effect on those edges, just reducing the impact of those edges a little bit more. I might just go to a localized color. It's a little bit dark. I picked it when it was further here, so I'm going to pick another color here, drag it into that circle, just lighten it up a bit. You find the balance, whatever suits yours better. If you place it lower down, you might need a darker color. Higher up, you might need a lighter color. Just move it down underneath the sun. Again, that's quite effective, isn't it? So I've just shifted it down underneath that top sun layer. I think perhaps that works even better. What I might do is slide and duplicate it and put one of the versions above and one of the versions below. The top version, I'll go to the N, just turn the opacity down, so I've got it at 0. Perhaps I'll put it up just a little bit, maybe at 20%. I think that works kind of nicely. Perhaps I'll go back to layer 9, which is down there now, the first one. Create a layer above it, change the blend mode from normal to add on that new version, that new layer rather. Tap on it, clipping mask, which means it links to that original shape. It means I can only add to the inside boundaries. I've got it on the soft brush with an airbrushing. I've got it on this orange. I'm going to put it to 1% size and maybe about 20% opacity. And just think where the sun is coming. Perhaps we could just have its impact felt on some of those shapes. Just soften that in. Give it like a 3D element almost. I don't want to do too much of that, but just a hint, just around the edges. Perhaps just rotate it and do it there as well. Just makes it feel a bit more like a real object in its environment. There you go, and I think it just feels a little bit more like an actual object in its environment a bit better now. So whether you like it with or without the symbol, it could just be a nice, dramatic, really positive looking sunrise, or add the symbol and obviously it has another level to the meaning. Okay, thanks so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you have a really amazing 2024. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe and I shall see you back here soon. Bye for now.